The period of the judges ruling Israel ran approximately from 1445 BC to 1050 BC. They were not good days for the nation. They departed from the faith, they abandoned the Lord, they ran after other gods, they tore themselves apart, until in desperation they cried out to the Lord. He would then raise up a judge, and the judge would lead his people, and oust their oppressors, return some order to the land. But that was always relatively short-lived. And they repeated this sort of awful cycle 6 times throughout those awful years. Other nations came and oppressed them. Eventually they would cry for deliverance. God would raise up a judge. Their oppressors would be put back. And then they would fall into sin, into apostasy, and oppression would start all over again. Mesopotamia oppressed them. Then Moab, then Canaan, then Midian, and the Amalekites, the Ammonites, finally the Philistines. And they're still the dominant force in all of the Middle East at this point where we're starting in 1 Samuel. They really were dark ages for Israel. Days of repeated unrest and general anarchy. True faith was not altogether absent, but it wasn't in plentiful supply. The nation was at a very low ebb spiritually. God's own comment at the end of the book of Judges was a terrible indictment on his own called out people. Judges 21 verse 25. In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. Not good. But God is now doing a new thing. And the book of 1 Samuel records significant steps forward in the unfolding of God's great plan of salvation. Instead of judges, we're going to see a monarchy established. That will bring a certain amount of stability. And God is going to make big covenantal promises regarding the throne that is established. The kingdom here beginning will be an everlasting kingdom. But it will also bring challenges, because the motivation for Israel's desire to have a king is that they can be like everyone else. They've got a king, they've got a king, we want a king. Now they have a king. The Lord is king. No, we want a king we can see. So there's trouble ahead as well. But where does this chapter then of God's story start? This particular new chapter that God is starting. And it starts where I believe God always starts. With the family. The family. At the very beginning, God introduces us in the book of Genesis to Adam and Eve, the first family. And then came the new beginning after the flood. And again, God starts with a new family. It's Noah and his wife, their 3 sons and their 3 wives. And then came the family that every Israelite looked back to as their true father. That's Abraham. Oh yes, we're children of Abraham. And the family that we now meet in 1 Samuel chapter 1 is descended from that family. And the narrative begins in verse 1 with the family history of this man Elkanah, the Ephrathite or Ephraimite. The town was about 10 miles north of Jerusalem. He came from there. He lives now in the mountains. But sadly, we need to introduce, which is pretty a common word in our day. It's not a nice word. It's the word dysfunctional. Dysfunctional. That's the kind of family that we're seeing. This family probably was as good as it got in those days of general unrest and anarchy, but they were very far from perfect. From our perspective, looking in on this family this evening, I think it's perhaps a good thing for us to see that God uses imperfect families. God uses messy relationships. God isn't holding back and waiting until we get ourselves sorted out, and then He'll use us. No, God can use broken tools to create something very beautiful. Now, verse 1 gives us some pedigree, and it looks good. Elkanah is actually a Levite. His tribe was given responsibility over the workings of the tabernacle. They were not given their own plot of land when the land was divided out, because they were to be scattered throughout all the other tribes. And their job was to keep alive the knowledge of God and the service of God. And we can expect God to be at work then in a family that is devoted to Him. Kind of starts off good. And then verse 2 lets us down with a bump. And he had 2 wives. That is, he had 2 wives at the same time. Now that may have been common enough in their day, but it was not biblical enough. God's plan for marriage has always been 1 man, 1 woman for life. But Elkanah, no, he's got 2 wives. He's disobedient. Okay, granted, in that day, it could have been much worse. If you want to turn back the last few chapters of the book of Judges, it is not comfortable reading. Mistresses, homosexuality, gang rape, murder. So we're kind of tempted to look at Elkanah, and he's not so bad. He's disobedient, but he's not all that disobedient. Now, his disobedience is, of course, still sin. And sin always brings misery. Oh, how we need to get that into our heads again and again. Sin always brings misery. If you're considering doing a sin, remember it. It'll always bring misery. And we're going to see misery coming out of this in a moment. But note in verse 3 that Elkanah has not given up on his faith altogether. He is still a religious man, but not too religious. He goes up to the tabernacle every year. Every year. Only once a year. And it looks as though he's as half-hearted about his relationship to the Lord as he is with his wives. But it seems in Israel, this is as good as it gets. Eli's 2 sons, they're also mentioned in verse 3, Hophni and Phinehas. We'll see them in action in chapter 2, where we're told that they didn't know the Lord and that they abhorred his sacrifices. This again is more sin in the background. And it sort of makes Elkanah, well, he's not so bad, you know. He is a religious man, but he doesn't take it too seriously. It's not a great place to start, is it? And yet, that's as we begin here tonight, I want you to be encouraged just to see where God can and does work. He can work, and He can make His plans happen, even when the world is racing on into anarchy. He can work even when the church seems kind of half-baked and not really catching the vision. He can work when our families are far from perfect, even dysfunctional and full of rows and bickering. He can do it. Because in the middle of all of this mess and lethargy and sin, we find Hannah. And she is the real thing. She is a true believer. She's going to make that very plain when she pours out her heart to the Lord in verses 10 and 11. She's really our focus now tonight, because she's the focus of this chapter. And as we look at her in the middle of the mess, we're going to see the hope of the gospel. And we'll see Jesus, the Saviour. First of all then, let's note, Hannah suffered. Hannah had no children. I can't really begin to imagine just what that is like, but from this story alone we can catch something of the anguish, of the pain that Hannah felt. She clearly desired to have children so very much, but up until this point in her life, it simply hadn't happened, and that was a real hurt in her life. And as distressing as that was for her on a personal level, there were other social ramifications as well, because we're in Israel. This is the children of Abraham, the man to whom God promised the blessing of children. Genesis 15:5. Now look toward heaven and count the stars, if you are able to number them. And he said to him, so shall your descendants be. The blessing of God was promised through his seed. And yes, that ultimately refers to Jesus. But Jesus would only come into our world as the son of Abraham. If Abraham had Isaac, and Isaac had Jacob, and Jacob had Judah, and the line would continue on down until Jesus. The blessing of God was always tied to children being born. And not just children in a direct line to Jesus. All children were viewed in this way. Psalm 127 verse 3. Behold, children are a heritage from the Lord. The fruit of the womb is a reward. And they are. And we do well to remember it. Let's never forget it. They are God's gifts to us. Even when they walk mud into the house, or scratch the car, or get in bother at school. Even if a policeman arrives at the door, they are a heritage from the Lord. They are precious gifts. I'm sure Peninnah's children got into bother. I'm sure they cost Elkanah the odd shekel or two. But Hannah would have given anything to have her own boy to shout at if he injured the horses or lost the sheep. But it was not to be. Hannah had no children. And I'm sure she knew her history. Sarah had no children, but then came Isaac. Rachel had no children, and then Joseph came. Manoah's wife, she was also barren until Samson was born. But that moment, it hasn't happened for Hannah yet. And she didn't know if it ever would. But she did know what everyone else knew. That when it came to the blessing of children, that blessing from God, she has been passed by. Some days I'm sure it hurt more than others. I think if we were to import Hannah into our setting today, I think September would have been a bad month for her. There's Peninnah, she's in a TIS, the kids are going back to school, got to get all prepared for that. Not for Hannah. December, I don't think, would have been a great month either. Kids are all getting worked up for Christmas. There'll be no presents to be bought for Hannah's children. She has none. Such thoughts, I admit, they're just speculation. But we do know that once a year, whenever the time came for Elkanah to make an offering in verse 4, that Hannah's suffering was aggravated greatly. The double portion that Elkanah gave to Hannah was bittersweet. And yes, it was a sweet thing that he did. And he did it because he loved her. We're told that in verse 5. What a lovely thing he did. He thought of her in that way. But still, it must have tasted bitter as well, because it was an official reminder that she had no children, that she was to be pitied, that she had been passed by the Lord with this particular blessing. But Hannah didn't want pity. She wanted a boy. But the Lord had closed her womb. Hannah suffered. Now pause for a moment and consider just what we're reading right now. For this is Holy Scripture. This is breathed out by God, the Lord of glory, the Lord of hosts. And we might think that he would never even see the anguish of this insignificant woman. Why would he ever be interested in her? But these verses, they are included in the completed Scriptures so that we might know that God does see, that God is interested, and that God does care. And we'll soon see that his care is more than an extra portion on the plate. And it's more than nice flowery words. Because God's love is all about giving. And ultimately that's displayed in its fullness when we look to the cross of Jesus. And we read John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. But maybe this evening you're in Hannah's shoes. Maybe it's not the exact pain of childlessness that you're suffering. You're suffering inwardly, as she was. Suffering in silence. Suffering in ways you maybe don't want to talk about. If you were to talk about it, you know the people would only show you pity. Be assured that God sees, that God does know, and that his ear is always open to the cries of his people. He knew Hannah suffered. Secondly, Hannah was reviled. Barrenness in Israel was shameful enough. The pain of heart was sharp enough, but it was exasperated not only by Elkanah's pity, but by Peninnah's scorn. In verse 6 we read, "And her rival," or her adversary, also provoked her severely to make her miserable, because the Lord had closed her womb. Oh yes, there was 3 in the marriage. That was never God's design. And sure enough, we see the misery that sin produces in those 2 little words that describe Peninnah. Her rival. Her adversary. I mean, it's bad enough that there should be rivalry between husband and wife. But it's awful when it's between wife number 1 and wife number 2. There's this rivalry going on. There's Peninnah. She has clearly won the numbers game when it comes to children. Verse 4, "Whenever the time came for Elkanah to make an offering, he would give portions to Peninnah his wife, and to all her sons," plural, "and daughters," plural. She's lots of children. She's won that one. But on the emotional level, on the love level, it seems that Hannah is well ahead. According to verse 5, "But to Hannah he would give a double portion, for he loved Hannah." And so Peninnah's desire then is to make Hannah miserable. And it's just awful. It's just sin. We're commanded to love our neighbour as ourselves. How much more within the church are we to love one another as Christ has loved us? But Peninnah, she's more interested in getting one up on her rival. This desire trumped the first and the greatest commandment as well, to love the Lord your God with heart, soul, mind and strength. Because Peninnah uses this sacred occasion and a sacred place to do her worst. Verse 7. "So it was year by year, when she went up to the house of the Lord, that she provoked her. Therefore she wept and did not eat." Now Hannah's heart is most tender when she comes before the Lord. She understands that he in his sovereign providence has done this. He has closed her womb. But she's not bitter. She's not wailing and shouting, "Why me?" No, but she's tender. And her heart is on her sleeve when she's near the tabernacle. And Peninnah, she sees this wonderful opportunity to provoke and to kick her when she's down, to abuse her when she's vulnerable. But it's God's tabernacle. Well, she doesn't care. This is more important. But it's a time of sacrifice, coming before God, seeing the price of sin as the animal is killed and put on the altar. No. Peninnah's only interested in getting the boot in. And the real rub, I think, is seen here. Because when we see Peninnah in her true colours, she's simply not good mum material. But she is a mum. Hannah is not giving back as good as she gets. She is suffering in silence. She is not reviling in return. She isn't even crying out to God for justice on Peninnah. She's lovely. And when the provocation gets too much, she just walks away in verse 9. And even then, she doesn't leave the table early. She has such wonderful and full respect for the things of God, for the sacred place, for the sacrifice, for the sacrificial meal. Peninnah understood her situation well. She reads her rival well and deliberately hurts her all the more when she is at her weakest. Add to this the words of Elkanah in verse 8. He clearly doesn't understand her pain, and he doesn't know how to hold his tongue either. It's when Hannah is at her lowest that he almost rebukes her for her pain. Hannah, why do you weep? Why do you not eat? Why is your heart grieved? Am I not better to you than 10 sons? No. To be frank, no, he's not. Because he's only half a husband to 2 wives. Yes, you may love Hannah greatly, but you still don't get it, Elkanah. You don't get marriage in God's terms anyway. And he doesn't get her pain of childlessness. Even if he is the perfect husband, she'd still have this pain. Children are a blessing from the Lord, but not to me. Where is it? And he doesn't get that. And then to cap it all off, this misunderstanding and aggravation, in steps Eli in verse 14 further down. How long will you be drunk? Put away your wine from you. He thinks that Hannah has had more than a double portion of wine. And so he has a go at her. He's a priest of God. He is acting as a go-between, representing the people to the Lord and the Lord to the people. But even here at the tabernacle, Hannah finds no solace, no understanding, only more reviling. Have you ever felt that no one understands? No one really gets what you're going through. You look around and it seems like other people's lives are pretty okay, hunky-dory. But they're not God's people. They're living their life without any reference to God at all. The only time they use God's name is for a swear word. And they make your life so difficult. And when you look for help, and you look to other people, maybe even in the church, you're misunderstood. You're kept at arm's length. You're treated like a drunkard. Oh yes, they see you've got troubles. That's because of your own sin. And their attitude to you as well. You need to put that sin away. Listen to how Hannah responds to the reviling. What does she say to Peninnah? Not a word. What does she say to Elkanah? Not a word. What does she say to Eli the priest? Verse 15 and 16. She simply explains what she's been doing in the tabernacle. It's nothing to do with wine being poured out, but it's everything to do with her soul being poured out before the Lord. There's no vice in what you see here, she says. I'm just hurting. I am suffering deeply inside, and I've brought it all to the Lord. The silent words which you didn't hear, Eli, they were for him. They were for the Lord of hosts. She doesn't get stuck into Peninnah when she's talking to Eli. Well, let me tell you about my husband's other wife. She doesn't get stuck into Elkanah when she's talking to Eli. Would you believe my own husband said this to me? And she doesn't even strike back at Eli. What could you know, old man? What are you talking about? Besides, why are you having a go at me? What about your own 2 sons? They're leering over every woman that comes within 10 feet of the tabernacle. No, none of that. Not a word of that kind of thing. She just takes it all to the Lord. All of it. Because thirdly and finally, Hannah was committed. She prayed to the Lord and she wept in anguish. She knew where to turn. She knew that even if no one else really understood her suffering, and if no one else really saw what Peninnah was doing to her, God would know. God would care. And if God was willing, he was able to do something about it. So she casts her burden on the Lord. She makes this vow in verse 11, O Lord of hosts, if you will indeed look upon the affliction of your maidservant and remember me, and not forget your maidservant, but will give your maidservant a male child, then I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life, and no razor shall come upon his head. Always submissive, always humble, always committed. God is the Lord of hosts. She's his maidservant. 3 times she refers to herself as maidservant, because in reality that's exactly who she is. She sees his greatness, she sees her own smallness. And really that's the grounds for her petition. Lord, I'm yours. I'm your maidservant. I want to serve you, and I will serve you with my own son, if you let me have one. What you give to me, I will gladly give him back to you. She doesn't bargain with the Lord. She's got nothing to bargain with. Any son born would be a Levite anyway, and would be in God's service in and around the tabernacle. The only thing she can do different is to bring him to the tabernacle early, even from his childhood. He would be devoted to the Lord for all his days, in accordance with the Nazirite vow. No wine, no razor on his head, devoted to God. Just like his mum. And note too the start of verse 12, where Hannah continues to pray before the Lord. Her prayer was not just a one-off event, a sort of last-ditched attempt to pry something out of the Lord, a sort of nothing-to-lose type prayer. It'll do no harm type prayer. No, she's committed. She's committed to praying until the Lord hears her cry and answers her prayer. She's fully committed. And after explaining herself to Eli, to be fair to Eli, he sees it. He sees her genuine faith and her devotion to the Lord. He listens to her explanation, recognizes true faith. Must have been a rarity in Israel in those days. And so he replies to her in verse 17, "Go in peace, and the God of Israel grant your petition which you have asked of him." And Hannah, she recognizes this as an answer, not just from Eli, but from the Lord himself. She goes away satisfied. She's satisfied that God has heard her prayer, and it shows on her face. It's no longer sad. And perhaps Elkanah and Peninnah may not have understood her change of demeanour. But Hannah knew. God has heard. And that's enough. She has cast her burden on the Lord. He will sustain her. Oh, believer, do this thing. Cast your cares upon him, because he cares for you. Even when no one else understands, even when others who are trying to help you just seem to make things worse, get to the tabernacle of prayer. Pour out your soul to the Lord. And don't try and hold the tears back. Let them flow, because he will hear, and he will answer prayer, and he will carry your burden. What's he like? What's it like to come before the Lord of hosts and pour out your heart to him? See, we may be fearful. We may wonder if he'd even be interested in listening to us and our little problems. But already we've seen that he loves his people, and he loves to give. But we see something further here of Jesus when we look at that inward beauty of Hannah. She suffered, she was reviled, yet she was committed. And that's just like Jesus. And some of you, I know you're waiting for me to say the verse. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 23. Who, when he was reviled, did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but committed himself to him who judges righteously. He's the one that we've come before this evening. He's the one who hears us when we pray. He's the one that we need when we suffer and when we are reviled. We need to commit ourselves again to him. We need to remember that there's no good seeking joy in this life just by winning the numbers game and making others feel miserable. Don't be a Peninnah. There's no good in having a foot in two camps, like two-wife Elkanah, trying to please the world and trying to play the part of religion as well. True peace and true joy only come from Jesus. So return again to him tonight. Come with your tears and unburden your soul to him. And when you're there, pray. Pray for things which you may well feel are impossible, because you come before the Lord of hosts. Amen. Let's pray just now.